Welcome everybody. This is our PCS 101 class for Thursday, the 14th. And as you know, I switched around some dates on the syllabus so that today, rather than giving speech number 2, we would be talking about persuasive speeches. That would give you a little bit more time to prepare for delivering speech number 2 tomorrow, which would be Friday, the 15th. And as you can see in the notes below, next week is our last week of the semester, so congratulations. I know it's been a long haul. And the week begins with Monday being Martin Luther King Day, so there are no classes, so there's a 3-day weekend. Then we move into Tuesday, which is the 19th, where we will have our third quiz on chapter 6 and chapters 11 and 12, and the last practice sessions that I will be setting up with you for your third and final speech. And based on the feedback that I've received from individuals, it seems that the majority wants to have a preparation day on Wednesday, the 20th. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So we will not be holding official class. This will be the day in which you can prepare for your last speech, which happens to be the persuasive speech. And that's what I'm going to be discussing today, the persuasive speech. And that will be delivered on the 21st, which happens to be Thursday. And then we end on Friday, the 22nd, with our fourth and final quiz. So in terms of the persuasive speeches, that is going to be a 15-minute speech. So it'll be the longest of the speeches, and you are going to be required to use 3 outside sources that you will be listing on your outline. You'll remember in a previous class I was talking a little bit about some of the ways that you could find outside sources, and some of you might elect to use some of those outside sources for your informative speech, but you will be required to do that with your persuasive speech. I stopped counting after 3, so you can use as many as you'd like once you hit the number 3, or as few as you'd like once you hit the number 3. And I'm not asking for any particular combination of sources, so you could use all internet sites or all books if you wanted to. And we had talked a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of the internet, and they're both similar in that there's a wealth of information. But that said, it oftentimes makes it difficult to find the information you want because there's so much information. And also, since the web is open access, we don't know necessarily if we can always trust that information. So I was encouraging you to use trustworthy sources and encouraging you to use the GCC library to assist you with your data gathering. And the GCC databases are particularly useful because they are very similar to websites, but they have been reviewed by experts in the field to verify that there's a certain level of authenticity to them. And that said, there are lots of different sources that you could use. You can use the traditional ones, which are books or magazines or websites, but you can also cite movies, and you can cite interviews. And we talked a little bit about, I believe, primary sources. Those are first-hand accounts, and secondary sources, and those are usually based on primary sources, and both are useful in that the primary source is the eyewitness, so obviously what they say has a certain level of validity, but that person could always be mistaken, or could be misremembering, or even downright lying. So when we talk about secondary sources, usually that's scholarship that's been based on primary sources. And again, there's a certain level of trustworthiness associated with them because there is a certain level of expertise associated with secondary sources. But that's not to say that secondary sources also couldn't be misguided in one way or another. So thinking about what resources make the most sense for you will probably be dependent on your particular topic. So for the persuasive speech, what you're doing is not necessarily talking about a fact, which is what you're talking about with your informative speech, but you are discussing an opinion, something that reasonable people could disagree about, a topic that can be debated. And you can decide to go very controversial if you so decided to. I've always argued that if you can't talk about controversial topics in college, then I don't know where you can talk about controversial topics. Or you can go with something that's less controversial. So, certainly, there's enough controversy in the news for you to choose from. And there are usually topics that are associated with controversy, those hot button topics, things like, let's say, death penalty, for instance, or abortion that you could always discuss. Or you can keep it rather neutral and talk about perhaps additional funding for education, lowering the cost of textbooks, um, improving one's diet, and all of those topics come with a certain level of challenge. Some of these topics are very difficult to convince an individual to take a position on, particularly if they have a strong position on the other side, especially those hot button topics, like, let's say, abortion or gun control. It's unlikely that you're going to change someone's opinion if their opinion is already firmly embedded. What you want to do is reinforce the opinion of those individuals who already agree with you, and perhaps you can get what I call the swing vote, so to speak, those individuals that are on the fence that could go either way. And that might not happen immediately. It could take days, months, maybe even years. You could just be planting a seed. And I've always said that the whole point of the persuasive speech is not to have the audience in its entirety agree with you. That's an impossibility. Instead, is to have the audience respect you, and that you are well prepared and you've put together a good argument. And if you're looking for topics, you might want to think about perhaps some papers that you've written in the past in other classes that might be able to be adapted for the persuasive speech. Or just think about the sorts of things that you talk about with family and friends. The "I wish this was different" kind of speech. And it oftentimes happens around the dinner table. Or you can again look at current events and see if there's anything there that inspires you. Or just reflect on a day or two of your life, because chances are that several things occur during the day that you probably wish were different, and they could perhaps be trans- translated into a topic for persuasive speech. And of course, since we will be having that last practice session, I wanted to talk with you about your topic and how you think you might proceed with that particular topic. Using outside sources enhances your credibility, which is one of the reasons why you're going to be using outside sources. And you want to refute the opposing side if possible, rather than pretending that there is no opposing side. That usually is a much weaker approach than acknowledging that there is another viewpoint, and briefly acknowledging, because you don't want to lose control of your position, and also illustrating how the opposing opinion or the opposing viewpoint is not nearly as strong as your own viewpoint. So there are lots of scholars that have worked about how to motivate individuals to change behavior or to change their beliefs. And so it's an inexact science that oftentimes involves psychology and sociology. But to incredibly oversimplify it, there are motivational appeals, ways that you can appeal to an individual so that they are likely to want to change their behavior or to change their beliefs or some combination thereof. And there are three in particular. One is affiliation. People have the desire to belong to something, to a group. The second is achievement or success. People want to be successful. And the last one is power or control. People want control over their environments. And if you think about television commercials, they use these appeals very well. How oftentimes they'll use the affiliation or belonging motive to try to encourage you to buy a product because lots of other people are buying that same product. It's the number one product. Or achievement, success, and how many television commercials associate their product with a certain level of success based on the way the individual is dressed, or the car the individual is driving, or the home in which the individual lives in. That one assumes that if one has that product, they can also have the comparable lifestyle. And power, control. And television commercials do this particularly well. The idea that you may not have power or control in your personal or your professional life, but you can at least control your vehicle. It's an environment that's all yours that you can control. And that said, there is one other motivational appeal that probably is more powerful than all of them, but you need to exercise great caution when using that motivational appeal, and that's fear. And fear does motivate individuals, but it also interferes with reasoning. Again, think about television commercials and how oftentimes they will utilize a fear of perhaps not having social relationships to encourage you to use a particular product. The idea that if you don't use the right deodorant, let's say, that you aren't going to be someone who's socially interesting. Um, Now, Monroe was a theorist who came up with something called the motivated sequence of events in terms of trying to encourage an individual to change their behaviors or to change their beliefs. And he got credit because he was the one who labeled it, but I suspect that this process is something that we know intuitively and honestly that we've been talking about all semester long. That first you need to get the audience's attention, and then you need to let the audience know there's some sort of need for change, and then you have to give some sort of way in which to satisfy that need, visualizing for the audience what would happen. And then if there is some sort of call for action, if you wanted someone to say, let's say, sign a petition, then you would do it at that particular point. And sometimes it's easier to change someone's behavior, and sometimes it's easier to change someone's belief system. It just depends. I think about all of those speeches about improving lifestyle with diet and exercise. Most people believe in that, but it's very difficult to motivate them to engage in the behavior. And that's something that you want to think about. How can I get individuals to change their behavior? There are other speeches where it's not too difficult to get somebody to engage in a particular behavior, but it may not necessarily reflect their beliefs. So, for instance, someone might sign a petition not because they believe in the cause, but purely because, let's say, they think it's a good photo op, or they just want to be left alone, so they quickly sign the petition so that they don't have to deal with the issue anymore, or whatever the case may happen to be. What you're doing is putting together an argument, which happens to be a claim, which you will provide evidence for, and some sort of a reasoning pattern. Lots of different ways that you could go about reasoning, and lots of different claims that you can make. And a claim of fact, which would sound as if it's not disputable, can indeed be disputable. So take a fact that something is or is not. GCC is a small school, let's say, for instance. That is indeed a fact. However, in comparison to what? So it could be debated. Some individuals might feel that GCC is quite a large school in comparison to other schools. Or claim of value that something is good or bad. Again, we'll take GCC again. GCC is a good school. And then the question is, how do we measure that? Is that through anecdotal stories? Is that through test scores or some combination thereof? There's also a claim of policy, in other words, claiming that a course of action should be taken. For instance, GCC should reestablish a sports program, and GCC once did have a sports program. And of course, there are pros and cons to both of the positions, and the question is, do the pros outweigh the cons? Our sports program was taken apart because of financial considerations back in the 90s, and it hasn't been reestablished. And again, we could say that that's a cost savings measure, but we could also say that the school has lost dollars through losing students who would have enrolled because there was a sports program. So it's not necessarily easy to separate cause and effect. Now, the kind of reasoning that you do, for those of you who like your detective stories, you're probably familiar with inductive reasoning, where you're using examples to try to derive some sort of a conclusion. And you're using deductive reasoning, where you're making a generalization based on those examples. So, for instance, inductive reasoning would be medical studies that are made in order to determine if a particular drug, let's say, is effective. And then one could deduce through a certain number of those medical studies that that drug is indeed effective. That said, it's not foolproof. So certainly we can deduce the generalization that college leads to success through inductive examples. There are enough people who've gone to college that have been successful that would seem to prove that point. But a generalization is not always universal. Just because college leads to success for many people, that doesn't necessarily mean that it leads to success to all people. But there's enough truth or validity to the statement so that it's possible, and I suspect that's one of the reasons why you are not only in college, but taking an incredibly intense intercession course as well. You can also reason from sign and observable mark. So, for instance, a cough might be a sign that you're having a head cold, that you've had that sign often enough that you've been able to induce, there have been enough examples of it, that you can link that cough to a cold and then deduce that the cough is what's leading to the cold. We can have many errors in reasoning, and this too is a class in and of itself. And I just wanted to very briefly talk about a few of the errors in reasoning, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of these. And the hasty generalization, in other words, having too little evidence in order to be able to form a conclusion, is a very common error in reasoning. One might assume, for instance, that there's a particular course at the college that is not very popular with students because it has not enrolled many students in the last several semesters. However, if you were to do further research, you could find that perhaps it hasn't anything to do with the course, and it has to do with the time of the course or the instructor for the course. So there could be all kinds of variables. You don't want to make a hasty generalization on too little evidence. Or an appeal to ignorance. In other words, what we don't know. And prove me wrong. I'm innocent, in effect, until you've proven me guilty, is a certain standard in the United States. But think about how this could be twisted and manipulated. I could easily tell you that I'm a space alien, and that until you can prove that I'm not a space alien, well, then I obviously am a space alien. Again, the burden of proof should be on me, not necessarily on you. The bandwagon fallacy of joining the crowd. Everybody wants to belong to the group or the clique or the tribe, so to speak. And again, this is oftentimes found in television commercials. Everybody wants to be like everybody else. And this is oftentimes something you see with teenagers as well, is that they want to be with their group, so to speak. The sequential fallacy, that the cause and effect are linked, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. So perhaps I didn't perform very well on the first quiz, and it could be because I had a cold. Or it could just be because I haven't been performing well on quizzes for the last several years, whether I've had a cold or not. So the cold is irrelevant. So we aren't necessarily sure if there's a direct causation of cause and effect. Begging the question, rephrasing the question, or in other words, circular reasoning. So, what is empathic listening? It's listening empathically. You might remember that from a quiz, for instance. And basically, what the question was asking you was to define empathy, not necessarily to rephrase the question. So, this is also very common. Or what is critical thinking? It's thinking critically. Again, you haven't answered the question, you've just rephrased the question. The appeal to authority, it sounds like there's validity to it, but the person who is viewed as the authority really isn't an authority at all. Take the celebrity endorsement, that's very common in advertisements, where you've got a celebrity, perhaps someone who is popular in entertainment or in sports, and they are endorsing a product that has absolutely nothing to do with their profession. The assumption being that if they are endorsing that product and we look up to that individual, we will want to also use that product, even though that individual has no expertise whatsoever in computers. But the idea is that if they happen to be one of our favorite singers, then we would want to emulate them by having the same computer system that they use. And again, this isn't necessarily logical, but we all commit errors in reasoning. Name calling, for instance, the attack on the individual. And sadly, we've seen this more and more in the political spectrum, where it seems that now many things have become curse words, like liberal and conservative, where in the past they were much more neutral. And it's the irony of talking about all of this today, the day of the impeachment, which is when I'm filming. I'm filming on Wednesday night for Thursday's class. It does not escape me, especially because I wanted to talk a little bit about how oftentimes very intelligent individuals will oftentimes make errors in reasoning. And if you've ever heard of Frank Luntz, and he's a he's a consultant, a political consultant, but he's also a business consultant about language, about what language to use to try to influence people's behavior and their beliefs. And some of the terms that are used in the political world are terms that were created by Frank Luntz. So if you ever heard of war on terror, for instance, that was deliberately created by him in response to the Iraqi war. And he indicated that he wouldn't necessarily call any war after a particular group of people because you wouldn't get as much buy-in than you would if you called the war on terror, because it's very hard to support terror. And he was very right in that respect. Or if you've heard anything about the death tax, which used to be called the estate tax, and it was very non-controversial. And basically what happens is that if someone has a certain amount of assets, after they die, some of them are taxed. Frank Luntz argued that estate sounded wealthy, and this is why most individuals didn't object to this. He suggested rephrasing that to death tax. And now all of a sudden something that was not very controversial became very controversial indeed. Same tax, just a different name. So it changed individuals' behavior. And talking about Frank Luntz, he argues that as much as individuals will maintain that they are guided by reason and logic, they really are guided by emotion. And I wanted you to watch a clip that I think illustrates this better than anything that could be shown in the reading. And there's an article that I have listed below from diverseeducation.com about a debate that went on several years ago between two academic institutions. So if you know anything about debate, these are teams that are made up of college students, and basically they put together arguments almost in the way that you might in a courtroom with a pro and a con. And then there are a series of judges. Usually these are the college professors who evaluate and try to make a decision as to which team put together the strongest arguments. And there were two debate teams, and they were debating about something that was very controversial, and it happened to be about race. So as I'm setting all of this up, I'm sure you're probably assuming that things went badly between the debate teams. That's not what happened. Things went badly between the debate coaches, the two professors from the two competing universities. Now, these are professors who had been experiencing some bad blood in the past. They had debated, or their teams had debated each other in the future. And there was also some wrinkles in terms of their relationship. The first debate coach was a Caucasian male, and the second debate coach was a female African American. So that led to a certain level of tension between them as well. And what's not important is necessarily what they were debating about. What's more important, at least for our purposes, is how they conducted themselves. In that they both disagreed vehemently, and it had something to do with the scoring. And instead of arguing about it in an academic way, they descended into all kinds of errors in reasoning, including name calling, with the use of some several choice profanities, and also a mooning. Yes, you heard me correctly, a mooning, and debate whether or not that mooning occurred. And this is where one of the professors, he lowered his pants to show his underwear, and whether or not just showing your underwear is a legitimate mooning, or whether the underwear needs to be removed is also, I suppose, another topic for debate. But ultimately, their conduct was completely unprofessional, and it resulted in one of them being basically fired from their position at the university, and the other being put on probation, and then being all over social media. And may this be a lesson to you that this debate was recorded and it was placed on social media, even though it wasn't supposed to be placed on social media, and it ended up going viral. And that's how the institutions found out about this debate and the conduct of these professors. And then the result of the the consequences of their behavior. So none of this would have happened if it hadn't been posted on the internet, but we live in a world now where everything is posted. And of course, both of these professors tried their hardest to have this removed from the internet, but once you have an electronic trail, it's very difficult to erase it completely. So I've got a small piece of footage of that debate. It's not very long, but it'll give you, in just those 2 or 3 minutes, an idea of the name calling and the descent really into unprofessional behavior of both of these professors. And I show this to you to indicate that even the most educated and the most intellectually aware individuals can have their buttons pushed and can engage in horrific behavior. And I encourage you not to do that. And again, the irony of talking about this during this particular time in our history is not at all lost on me. So I did want you to watch that, if for nothing else, to see how ultimately you do not want to conduct yourself, and how when you are disagreeing with someone, that there are other ways to go about disagreeing. So all of this is going to lead to an attendance question that will be based on tomorrow's class, because tomorrow is going to be when you will be delivering your second speech, your informative speech. And it seems that most of you want to upload your speech, so I'm going to be posting a folder at the top of our Moodle page for you to be able to do that, unless you've elected and you've contacted me to deliver your speech via Zoom, and then we will do the Zoom presentation on Friday. So your attendance question is to watch all of the peer speeches that will be uploaded by Friday midnight, and to send one strength and one weakness of each of your classmates' speech number 2, the informative speech, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by Saturday the 16th, by midnight, or 11:59 p.m. And you've already done this with speech number 1, and you can see that I have gathered all of the information that you put together for your peer feedback for speech number 1, the autobiographical speech. And this is in our notes below as well, so that you can see what your peers have said about your speech. And you should have received my feedback by now in my evaluation of your speech. You see that I used a template that basically reviewed your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. I would have written a few side notes. For the second and the third speech, I'm not even going to use that template. I'm just going to take a sheet of paper and write down notes as they occur to me. So I believe that covers most, if not all, of what we need in relation to our textbook. So next class, we have our informative speech, and then we will move forward next week with a quiz, and then preparation day, and then finally the persuasive speech and the last quiz. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I look forward to hearing your informative speeches. Take care. Bye-bye.